Yeah, thank you, Stephen. And thank you, Baria. Well, actually, this is to follow up how last questions. I had similar things in mind. First, you mentioned about the Islamic Brotherhood and also the Salafis. But I wonder because you didn't really mention about any specific group. This is also on what Haula mentioned. So, are there any specific groups you mentioned in the book? Of course, if I read the book, then I will know. But since we haven't read the book yet, so is there any specific group in terms of Salafism in this context that you would like to make comparison with the Islamic Brotherhood, or it's just Salafism in general? And then secondly, again, this is similar to Buhauna's question, but she mentioned about followers. What I would like to know more is about uh, you talk about the relationship between the state and then Islamic Brotherhood and then the Salafis. But what about the people? What about the, let's say, Muslims or even ordinary Muslims or even non-Muslims? Do you portray them? Do you include them in your discussion, or you just simply neglect them, or what? Could you please explain about it? I think yeah, that's it. Thank you very much.
So Yanwar, it's one question, and that offers me the opportunity to clarify this. It is actually about ordinary people. Like, I mean, what I'm really trying to do in this book is to look at how mainstream conceptions are affected by, you know, competing discourses. So, I mean, you do have organizations, I mentioned a few, Ansar al-Sunnah al-Muhammadiyya in 1926, Dawah Salafiyya in the late 1970s, Hizb an-Nur in 2011, mention a few more. But I mean, those organizations are important because those are, entrepreneurs who are actively pushing in the battle of ideas. But I'm also more interested in how ideas redefine people's understanding of their faith. So it's kind of, in a sense, I mean, you do have people who would self-describe as Salafis, and usually those would be part of one of these organizations. But it goes much beyond that, right? There's a lot of, I mean, let's put it this way, many ideas that were promoted by Salafis for the last 100 years have increasingly been seen by a lot of people as mainstream ideas. People who would not describe as Salafis, they would give you a Salafi response to the question you ask. And if you ask them, are you Salafi? They say, of course not. Maybe they don't even know what that is. So what's interesting is that we're looking at something that goes much broader than simply people within the movement who are, the Muslim Brotherhood is a different animal. Brotherhood is classical 20th century organization with kind of membership, commitment, it's like, and then compared to many of these 20th century organizations, right? The Salafism is kind of much more diffuse. I mean, you do have groups and movements who have a overall agenda, but you also have something that is more the kind of a very liquid type of discourse in many ways, right? Which people just adopt without really necessarily. I mean, if you look at today, just pick one example, and there's many we could mention, but like if you compare what Egyptians today think of Mawlids, so when we say Mawlid, by the way, it's not just like in Indonesia, Mawlid Nabi, but it's also the Mawlids of the saints. Egypt has a very strong tradition of celebrating the saints. So it's here in Indonesia. I don't think it's different. We have different traditions, but that one, which is that every year for the anniversary of the saint, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people converge to the saint, and they stay there for several days, and it becomes a big form of popular celebration. And this was huge. I mean, in the past, before when traveling to Mecca was more difficult, more people went to these same pilgrimages than they went to Mecca. It was and some scholars have kind of argued that this kind of replaced pilgrimage to Mecca in the popular mind because people couldn't go to Mecca anyway. It was too complicated, too dangerous. So I mean, up to maybe 50, 60, 70 years ago, most people would probably go there at least think it's okay to go there, In the 90s, Muhammad used to do that. Today, most people you would ask, they would say, no, this is bid'ah, it's terrible, shouldn't do that, it's not Islam. So it's interesting, something has shifted, right? The public appreciation of these, in that sense, the notion of what is orthodox has changed, right? So this is really what I'm looking at. In many ways, the book is really more about ordinary Muslims than it is about specific organizations. But of course, specific organizations matter as well because they actively work in that battle of ideas that I'm trying to describe. In that sense, I agree more with him than for those of you who read into this. I agree more with him than Viktorovitz. So I think Viktorovitz misses something completely. Like, there's those two tracks, is the Salafism and Islamism, and then they start to get into Torah. The Salafis, I didn't talk about that in my presentation, but it gets more complicated at some point because there starts to be mutual influences. And so what he calls politicals are just, either, people following an Islamist grammar of action, but adopting elements of Salafi discourse, which becomes more and more common. The Salafi discourse starts to permeate everything. Or, so the fact that he says there are three types of Salafism, I'm not convinced by that. To me, Salafism is a project of purity, if you define it by what it is fundamentally. And Islamism is a political project. And then these things sometimes can kind of start to mingle and produce new things with discourse and grammar sometimes in a different nature. You can have an Islamist grammar of action and a Salafi home of religious substance. So I'm more Heikel than Viktorovitz in that sense, yes. And I explained that a little bit in the book.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. I know we're running out of time, but I would like to invite questions from audience if there's one. Is there anyone else from the back row? Oh, okay. Two.
Okay, my name is Asep. I'm from Faculty of Social Science. I have two questions. The first is about that entrepreneurial spirit of Salafism, because when I started my undergrad in Yogyakarta, it was the first time of Islamic revival phase in Indonesia. That suddenly my friend started to wear hijab, female friends, and fast forward right now, I can say that Salafism is the most popular part of Islam for the new hijrah people in my close friend. So when my close friend, for example, resigned from bank, then she or he decided to do more religious thing, they will instantly join Salafism. At the beginning, I was full of skepticism because my religious training in Pondok Pesantren. But then recently, I incline more to the Salafi mosque in Jakarta, and my very impression when I entered the mosque is that the carpet smell good, and that is for me it is like the end of discussion. I'm no longer thinking about theological debate or something else, but in practical reason, the carpet smell good, and then they manage the money very well compared to other religious institution from Indonesia in managing the mosque. So my question is that entrepreneurial spirit was originated in Salafism? It is true that the entrepreneurial spirit has been becoming the more attractive part of the Salafism in Egypt, for example. So I want to know more about that entrepreneurial spirit in Salafism. And secondly, Muhammad mentioned about official Islam, and maybe in Egypt we can say that Al Azhar was very well established in informing that official Islam. But in Indonesia, we can say that maybe Triple IU was quite late in informing that official Islam. So if we talk about Salafism in Indonesia, and we can say that there is no such thing as official Islam in Indonesia because there is no such institution such as Al Azhar. How do you see that prospect of Salafism in Indonesia without such well-established institution such as Al Azhar? So that is my question. Thank you.
There's a different number of elements here, which I think might explain that. So basically, from what I understand, and it was the case in Egypt in many ways as well, Salafism attracts very different profiles from what traditional religious organizations attract. So usually these people who actually haven't gone through formal Islamic education, and I'm thinking here about also the an article we've been working on with Payano. So usually it's people who don't have the same kind of training, who tend to be professionals. Many of them actually, working in the private sector. So they tend to come from very different backgrounds. And here in Indonesia, from what I understand, and I may be wrong, there tends to be a very strong class element, like it's kind of a middle upper class type of movement, which is not always the case in Egypt, which is interesting. In Egypt, you have different types of Salafism. So you have like a really kind of a working class Salafism, which is kind of distinct from a middle upper class Salafism. So, but of course, maybe this class element plays in, the background of these people play in. I mean, it's kind of pretty obvious that, when I describe in the 20s and 30s, when these people, they come from a very different background. They're not products of traditional education. So maybe it makes them kind of more in tone with the use of whatever modern means there is, which may also mean, more familiar with market techniques, more familiar with, of their days. So the fact that they're kind of out of the traditional forms of religious education and more in tune with it's whatever the market is. I don't know if that works and if that's the case. I mean, you would need to ask about the profiles of these people to make sure this is what you see. But and the second question, sorry, I'm getting about Al-Azhar and and in Indonesia. Yeah. I think in Indonesia, again, this is really, I don't like to talk about things I haven't studied properly, and I don't feel like I have enough knowledge or authority to say anything here. But what I feel is that there is one big difference in Indonesia, which is really the existence for the last century of a very strong and organized traditionalist organization. Because there's nothing such in it. The traditionalists, when they joined the battle against the Salafis in the 20s, they're dispersed, they're scattered, they don't have a common effort. There's not that kind of structure. So although you don't have official Islam in Indonesia, you do have two big Islamic organizations that function in some way. Although it's not official, but still structure the Islamic sphere in Indonesia, right? And one of them is a major traditionalist organization that has its legitimacy, its history, its centrality. And I think that kind of explains probably why, in many ways, but again, this is really very preliminary and I would need to think about this more, and so I shouldn't even be saying this, but I could explain why Salafism has not been successful in Indonesia in the same way it has been in places where there was not this kind of traditionalist challenge. So I think in Indonesia, things have always been much more balanced in that kind of, and the reformist challenge as well. So you had those different factions in Indonesia as well. Reformist Muhammadiyah as well were there. So there was a much kind of more, like the counter movements to Salafism were much more organized and influential here. But again, this is just me thinking at this point, and I may consider in a year that what I'm saying is wrong. I don't want to say more.